Welcome to Baby in the House, the podcast where we tackle all those tough parenting questions where everyone's got an opinion, from grandparents to neighbors to that nosy lady behind you at the line in the grocery store.
Where we examine the research, share our experiences, and those of the families we care for. We give you the clarity and confidence you need to make the right choices for your baby and family.
Without guilt, confusion, or analysis paralysis. Let's talk about discipline for babies, because this is one where I hear a lot of parents, a couple things. One is like, when can we start doing timeout? When should we discipline them? Are we going to spoil them if we just give in to their every demand as a young baby? And there's so much different information there, but I would love to hear from you, Tina. What do we know about when babies, are understanding of what discipline means and how to roll that out so that you don't feel like baby's just walking all over you, I guess.
Yes.
But at the same time, like respecting the fact that they're babies and they don't understand a lot of like the verbal discipline that we would try and enact before, whatever age you think. Lay it on me about discipline for babies.
That's exactly right. And since we're really talking about babies, we're not going to get in too much into like types and techniques. Like we're not going to get into the details of spanking and timeouts and all this. We can at some other point, but really we're talking about babies. And so what we really want to focus on is discipline philosophy. And I'll tell you, as a mental health clinician and a parenting specialist who's done a lot of sessions with parents around discipline, it is really rare to have parents who have even thought about a discipline philosophy. Like, what is it we believe? Now, they have lots of beliefs, they have lots of values, and rarely are parents kind of even on the same, they're never on the same page, but it's like, you hope they're at least in the same book when it comes to discipline. But a lot of people don't think about their discipline philosophy. You think it's just something that comes naturally, or there's a bunch of stuff from your past and your beliefs that you haven't thought about that can sort of take over. So I remember my sister, who is a wonderful mother, she had babies after I did. And so she was like, hey, when do we start disciplining? And I think that's such an important question, because it leads us to this question of what discipline is. And if you think about the goal of discipline, ultimately, it's to raise a child who is self-disciplined. And so if you're an effective disciplinarian, then over time, you should actually be disciplining less and less and less as development unfolds, right? Because they are becoming self-disciplined. And so really this takes us back to fundamentally what discipline is. It is not about punishment. Punishment is a way people attempt to discipline. It's not about consequences. Again, that's a strategy some people use. But what it truly is about teaching and skill building, so that our children can have better ways to handle themselves so they become self-disciplined. So when do we start? From the very beginning. From the very beginning, discipline, because it's about teaching, right? So when we think about that, part of discipline is even teaching our child that they can trust us. So those moments when infants look at their parents to determine whether something is safe or dangerous. Like, they look at you, and if you look scared, they know it's something frightening is happening. Or if you look relaxed and nod, like, go ahead, you can touch that, they know they can go ahead and touch that. And so they're learning from the very beginning. And so, it is many months before they start pushing boundaries, right? Like the first few months, they're not pushing boundaries. By ages like 4, 5, 6 months, you might start seeing some things that maybe behavioral issues, like babies biting at the breast, or they're throwing food on the floor, or things like that. So once they start doing some boundary pushing, just know it never goes away. 20-year-old.
You mean like even when they're like teenagers or 30-year-olds, they still...
I can speak to 20-year-olds and they're still boundary pushing. And then the key is to figure out, okay, what's my role parenting an adult child, right? And should I even be setting any boundaries? And so that's a whole other thing too. But it's really important to think about this from the very beginning, because the way we start setting up our thinking around discipline sets the foundation for the kind of parent we're going to be and how we're going to do this. So I think it's really helpful to think about sort of where these different, so most people have heard about these different approaches when it comes to discipline. So you've probably heard of like authoritarian, and permissive and authoritative. One of the ways that we can think about this is back from Diana Baumrinn's stuff in the 1960s, where she really sort of looked at these two dimensions, and it's still with us today. This is still how we think about the science of discipline. And so one dimension used to be called the control and demandingness dimension. And I kind of don't like those terms because, Phil, if you've ever tried to force a child to go to the bathroom, eat food, or fall asleep, you truly realize you cannot control another human being. You can't.
Those are the power centers of babies. Yep.
Right. Because they know. They know
and pooping, eating and sleeping. Totally.
Exactly. So you learn early on as a parent, you really truly can't control your child unless you're going to use excessive force, and that's actually cause trauma. So that dimension we're going to call the structure dimension. So you can be really high on that dimension. You can have clear, consistent limits and boundaries and have high expectations. So that'd be high on structure. If you're low on structures, you don't really set boundaries or limits. Anything goes, that kind of thing. And there's another dimension that we also have to look at, and this is previously called the warmth or nurture dimension, but I like to call it the connection dimension, because you can be warm and nurturing, like meeting your child's physical needs, but not really be emotionally attuned or connected or tuned into your child's emotions. So I like to call it the connection or emotional responsiveness dimension. But this is really, it is warmth and nurturing and kind of tuning into your child and providing them with comfort and care. Okay, so those two dimensions, you can be high or low on either of those. So the way people kind of fall into this is what determines those categories. So if you're low on structure and you're low on connection, that's neglect. That's just basic neglect. And we know that's really bad for kids. If you're low on structure, but high on connection, that is what we call permissive parenting. And of course, that's where you don't make a lot of demands or setting limits. If you are really high on structure, but low on connection, that is what's called authoritarian parenting. And that's more of the command and demand, stricter kind of approach. Often where parents have really high maturity demands, even if the child isn't developmentally there yet. But this is very much the do as I say, don't ask any questions, obeying authority, power and control kind of parenting. Then the fourth category is the one that science says is best for parents to do, with a few exceptions that I'll talk about. So this is where we are high on structure, right? So we are setting limits, we have high expectations, we have boundaries, and we're also high on connection. So we might even have some empathy, like, I know you don't like that I told you you have to wear a helmet when you ride your bike, right? So or we say to our 1-year-old, I know you want to touch that, but you can't touch that. That's not okay. That's not safe, right? And we take something away from them, right? So that's, I'm setting a limit, I'm setting a boundary, but I'm empathetic that that's upsetting to my baby. Okay, so this is where we would have both. And this, when we do this form of discipline philosophy, authoritative, the science is showing that kids turn out more empathetic and caring. There are less behavioral problems, less aggression, higher moral reasoning. And what happens is when we are really relational in our approach, and Dan Siegel and I talk about connect and redirect, right? So you're connecting with your child's internal experience and redirecting the behavior. And another way to think about that is maybe saying no to a behavior while saying yes to your child's experience and emotions around the behavior, right? But when we do this, it's much more about collaborative communication as opposed to power and control. And it's really, what's important about that is that as kids get older, then the research shows that kids who are raised with authoritarian, permissive, or neglect forms of parenting, when problems and issues come up in their life, they actually go to their peers. But kids who are raised with authoritative parenting will go to their parents more often when something needs to be. So it's really, again, that building that relationship. Yeah. So anyway, a couple of just little exceptions that I want to mention, because this is really important, is that some research has showed, and there's not a lot around this, but there's some research that shows that the positive outcomes for authoritative parenting don't always apply in the exact same way for kids who are growing up in low socioeconomic status, some ethnic diversity and educational diversity. We might see some different things. So for example, kids who grow up in low SES who have authoritative parenting, they may not have as high of academic results. And we're not going to go into a full discussion here, but Gwen Dewar wrote about this and says that kids who live in high risk environments that are dangerous may do better and get into less trouble if they're just obedient instead of kind of thinking for themselves and being more collaborative and maybe even arguing back about a rule that was set. And then also, there's also some studies that have shown that children of Chinese descent in Hong Kong and here in North America have better academic results, just academic, so not the other things that I mentioned, when they're parented with a more authoritarian style, so high on structure, less connection. But even the research is kind of confusing around that, because we have to kind of question if that truly is authoritarian, because the studies are actually showing that those kids develop more closeness with their parents than their American counterparts. So anyway, we just have to also look at, even if you have better academic outcomes, at what cost, right? Like if you do command kind of thing. So in fact, just really, we were talking more about babies, but there are always complications that arise when we look at the research. But aside from some exceptions, the science clearly argues that kids do better when parents are emotionally attuned and responsive and connected and have limits and boundaries, because those limits and boundaries help them feel safe.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So really,
rather than just anything goes, best.
That's right.
Touch the outlet.
And, really, this, when we think about if we think our job as disciplinarians is to do like command, demand, punishment, we really have to ask the question, is my kid even learning anything? And so I think about how if we really reframe discipline moments as opportunities to teach and build skills, and we think about our role as being teachers, not punishers, this is just huge, because we do start having these teachable moments when our babies, like I said, are biting at the mouth or at the breast or reaching for unsafe objects or whatever. And if we remember that our job in that moment, and really being committed to consistently, but not perfectly, providing our child warmth and connection while giving them firm boundaries. And I think it's so important that our babies start internalizing that word no. And of course, then they take charge of it themselves. But the way this would look is like, I know you really want to touch that, but that's not safe. Or I see you're having a hard time. I will help you. Those kinds of things. So when they get that kind of discipline, they are better able to control their own emotions and set their own boundaries over time. So anyway, we want to just stay tuned to our child. The more responsive we are as well, the more proactive we can be. Like we can see a discipline issue coming up. You're visiting grandma's house. There's fancy breakable things everywhere. Like pick them up and move them. And you go like, oh, I know my kid wants to explore. That looks really sparkly, So we just want to kind of set our babies up for success.
Sure. Then you don't have to be constantly, don't touch that. Don't touch that. Like that takes, the babies can sense that stress, and it just takes the fun out of the whole visit if you're just constantly like on them, watching them go from thing to thing and telling them not to do that.
And I think too, we have to like developmentally appropriate expectations. And I think that's really confusing to parents. I mean, how are we supposed to know? We weren't taught this, right? So, if you expect your 8-month-old, when they throw a green bean across the room and you say no throwing food, that they listen to you, they process that information, and then regulate their physical impulse to do that. Like developmentally, they can't listen and just follow your instructions at that point.
Right.
And so if we believe that they're capable of following directions and resisting temptations, then we might get angry, and we might even feel it's like a personal affront and this is a discipline issue and we have to nip it in the bud. But if you understand that your 8-month-old is probably just experimenting with skill building, like understanding gravity and physics and, motor skills, and it's like a little lab experiment right there in the high chair. Then yes, you can remove the tray. You can say, okay, we're done eating, and you can move. You don't have to let them wing green beans across the kitchen. But you don't expect them to, and that's where a lot of discipline problems and even abuse come from, is when a parent has an expectation that the baby can't fulfill. And so we just have to make sure we're educated about those things.
That's exactly how I explain it to parents is parents often have specific questions like, should my baby be doing this, or shouldn't they be doing this, or why do they keep doing this even though I tell them not to? And if you can look at what the developmental expectations are, as the example that you pointed out is perfect, like the throwing the green beans on the ground. One is that it's fun. Two is you get a reaction from mom and dad. And so I'm going to do things that get a reaction. So if instead of, the big reaction of don't throw green beans, or, how dare you, or they're starving kids and wherever, then that's way above the level of development that they should be at. And I really like how you said that you can use connection and warmth to help move to the place where here are the guidelines, here are the guardrails that I'm going to put up to keep you safe. Oh, we can't touch the outlet because we could get hurt.
Yep.
I know it looks really neat, but let's go over here and play with that instead. You can do things like that. And I love it when kids are throwing a fit or really upset in the room, because I can teach parents that so quickly when I just adapt the child's tone. And I don't have to do it at 100%. I can do 30% of their screaming tantrum. Oh, Walter is so upset. Something like that. And the kid stops and they look at me like, oh, that guy's speaking my language. He understands what's going on. And so I try and teach parents that in the exam room too, of you can show them that you understand, even if saying, I know that, Walter, you must be really upset because you lost your chance to eat green beans, something like that a 8-month-old doesn't get, but you can take their tone and then they will see that, okay, my parent gets it, even though we can't keep doing this, I feel understood. So yes, I think that's a perfect explanation for the type of discipline that you can. It's more of the discipline mindset that you can have throughout childhood, adolescence, adulthood, rather than like the specific things that you can get your child to do or not do at a certain age.
That's exactly right. And I think I love your idea of kind of matching, but not at the same intensity. I think, one of the key things throughout childhood, and it really in all of our relationships throughout our lifespan, is we need to feel felt. We need to feel like if you inside of you feel upset and someone tells you it's not a big deal, there's a disconnect there. So your experience and the way the person responds to you are not a match. So then you're like, ooh, either I'm wrong to feel this way, or I can't trust that they get me. And neither one of those is good. So really tuning into your child and saying like, ooh, you're so curious about that lamp, or you're so curious about that hole in the wall right there. That's so interesting. It's not safe to touch. Let's go find a bird outside. I think I hear one, right? Or you just you move on. All of that is so important. And I think one thing that I think is so crucial is to remember that, and not everyone believes this, but a lot of people have really just never thought about it, is that I truly believe that kids do well when they can, that they truly want to. No kid likes having their parent be upset with them. No kid likes having their teacher be upset with them. Like especially if we have connected, warm relationships with them, they want to please us. Now, that doesn't mean they don't also want to experiment with something or see what happens when they push it. Like a lot of times boundary pushing happens because kids do feel safe and they do have secure attachment with us, and they know they can't lose our love and that we're safe to test those boundaries within. And so that is a healthy part of individuation, and it's a healthy part of development to push boundaries. So if your infant does something you've told them not to, if your toddler does, good. That means that development is unfolding the way it's supposed to. And that I love this analogy that Dan Siegel has, where if you think about if you're riding across a skinny bridge and there's no railings, and you're riding your bike across, you have to be really careful and cautious, and you can feel fearful, and you can't really just ride freely. But if there are rails up, you can just ride freely. And so when we give our kids rails and limits and boundaries, it does create safety for them. It creates the predictability that their brains love. It really allows them to be freer to explore the world because they know there's sort of a container around what's okay and what isn't. And so it's loving to give our kids boundaries, but we can't, and parents worry about spoiling. And so remember, this is not about being permissive. So here's what the research is really clear on also, and that is that you cannot spoil your child and that's actually such a weird word. I don't even know if I like it, but you cannot spoil your child by being too high on connection. You cannot be too affectionate. You can't be too attuned. Well, actually, there's whole enmeshment things, but you can't be emotionally responsive enough. Like we want to love them and pour nurturing and warmth on them. And that is not what spoils them. What spoiling is about not being high enough on the structure dimension. So, if you have limits and boundaries, and it's fine even to change your mind. I know there are times as a parent where I've been like, well, I told them they couldn't swim the rest of the summer because I got really mad in a moment. And I was like, you can't swim the rest of the summer, or you can't go to grandma's house. And then I'm like, I need him to go to grandma's house because I have a dentist appointment. Like, we sometimes set a boundary that doesn't make sense, that we can't enforce, or we set a boundary and our child is like, well, actually, Mom, that's not what happened. And they give you more information, or they have a really good argument for why you should change your mind. Those are moments we can change our mind. And there's a huge difference, Phil, I think, in a child whining and whining and whining and saying, okay, fine, you can have the bucket. Right. And your child, you say you can't have the bucket. And then your child's like, Mom, I really want to put my rocks in it. And I promise I'm going to keep my hands to myself. And you say, okay, I'm going to change my mind about the bucket. Show me that you can be a kid of your word. And this is a good opportunity for you to show me that you can be responsible. So I think it's okay to say, you know what, I've changed my mind about that. I've thought about that and I've changed my mind. You're still in authority when you say, I've changed my mind. You're not giving in. So I think we want to have firm boundaries and expectations and limits, but we want to we don't want to be rigid in a way that doesn't make sense. And we want to model for our kids that when you have more information, you might change your mind. I think the key to all of this, though, is remembering that, especially this first year, that our main job as disciplinarians, and of course I mean teachers when I say that, is to train ourselves. This first year is sort of like our boot camp and thinking about how it is we're going to assume our child is wanting to do the right thing and that what they're doing is important for some reason, even if it's developmental experimentation or whatever, that they're not out to get us, that they're not out to make our lives hard, even though they do at times. And really learn that first year how to train ourselves and how to calm ourselves. One of the most important things, if we think about discipline as teaching, is that your child has to be in a receptive state of mind in order to learn, and you have to be in a calm, regulated state in order to teach well. So we always want to sort of ask the question, like, what is it I want to teach here? Okay, I want to teach them to keep their hands to themselves, or to be a good first-time listener, or whatever it is. But we can't do that. So we first want to say, like, is my child ready to learn? And we have all these like assumptions that if you don't respond to a small child immediately after the infraction, they won't know. That is not true. That's based on 50s animal research. My retriever's like that. I need to show her right then and there. But even infants, we don't have to do it like that. But we have to learn how to keep ourselves calm, because we want to first do no harm. We never want to be too rough with our children's bodies or terrify them or frighten them by screaming and yelling at them. When we do have ruptures, if we're too hard on our, like I remember, nursing and my son, biting me really hard. And, you have an instinct in the moment where you're like, ow, and you like yank the baby away from you. And then your baby's crying. And then you feel that. And then, so then it's like, it's okay. You're safe, no biting. And you just repair, you move from that rupture back to a repair. I think holding in mind the idea of limits with empathy, or empathetic boundaries, or however you want to do it, those things, connect and redirect, or structure and connection, should always go together. And then finally, I remember so many moments as a parent. Like I remember once with my 2-year-old, I don't even remember what the issue was. Of course, it was something that, he didn't like, or I didn't like, or something. I set a boundary. He started crying, kind of got out of control, started hitting me. So I tried to like take him to timeout, and he wouldn't stay in timeout. And I'm like, well, now I have to show him who's boss. Like, I can't let him think he can get away with everything. Right. But in that moment, I forgot about teaching, and it was all about power and control. And so then I gently restrained him and held him, and then he was trying to break out of my arms. And by the end of all of this, I was like, what am I even doing? Like, I'm not teaching anything. He's not learning anything. And so it really set me on the journey to think about how a lot of what we do in the name of discipline is actually counterproductive. It makes things harder because we're not teaching anything and they're not learning anything. So if we really hold teaching as our mantra when it comes to discipline, that begins in the very earliest of days, teaching them they can trust us, teaching them that we will set limits that keep them safe, that they can count on us, teaching them that we're going to follow through when we say something, if we say, when you throw another one, mom's going to take the tray away, and they throw another one, right. Hey, you're done, and we take the tray away, like we follow up. Or we just, again, in that moment, be like, okay, I'm going to have a big mess to clean up. Let's let them play with the green beans, and I'm not going to have an expectation that's going to make things hard on both of us. It's about being flexible and remembering that it's all about teaching, and that sometimes what we're trying to do is counterproductive. So we got to recalibrate and keep learning ourselves. Discipline is about learning for us too.
I think that just puts such a nice bow around all of the questions of discipline in the first year of life, because really, like you said, it's about us as parents feeling like we can understand and have an idea of what we want discipline to look like, rather than worrying that we're going to spoil our child, or a specific scenario is going to turn them into a spoiled brat or something like that. Is just to work on preparing ourselves for the coming years as a parent and as a teacher, rather than as a strict disciplinarian, authoritarian figure. So I love that approach.
I think, that authoritative piece, just keeping in mind, it's again, high structure, high connection, that you should feel all the freedom in the world as a parent of a baby to hold them as much as you want, as much as as much as you can handle. Sometimes you get tired of that, but you can't spoil your baby by being too emotionally responsive, by helping them build trust. And the attachment literature is so clear on this. 50 years of research that shows that when kids feel safe and that they've had parents who are emotionally responsive to them, it actually helps them go toward independence, because then they feel safe enough to go out and explore the world, because they know you're going to be there for them. And when we prematurely push kids to independence, it actually can backfire. It can make them either more dependent on us, or it can make them disconnect from their own feelings of fear. So nurturing them, being emotionally responsive, holding them, comforting them, all of those things actually lead to a more self-disciplined, independent child. So feel free to spoil them, I'm using air quotes, with your love and affection and attention, but do set those boundaries and limits too. That's what's going to keep them from being spoiled and from being amazing humans who know how to regulate themselves and continue to learn in the world.
Well, unfortunately, these babies that we're talking about take a long time to develop a lot of those things. So you have plenty of time and so many opportunities to practice. So it's not like you have to have all this figured out. Yeah. They'll give you plenty of time to put those things to practice. So, well, this has been a fantastic episode. We talked about bathing. We talked about discipline for babies. And we'll be back again next week with another episode of Baby in the House. In the meantime, feel free to leave a comment, write a review, leave a rating in iTunes, share it with a friend, and we will see you again next week.